The Pope's recent visit to Alberta was greeted with mixed emotions as Catholic Church leaders met with Canadian Aboriginal members in Edmonton this week. Much work has been done on truth and reconciliation for the atrocities of Canadian residential schools and the legacy of pain and trauma many say the school experience left behind in the families and homes of the Canadian First Nations. Well, joining me today to discuss the Pope's visit to Canada is Professor Crystal Gail Fraser from the University of Alberta. We're so happy to have her with us. Ms. Fraser, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for the interest.
Okay, so now you are part of the governing circle guiding the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. That's huge. So I would like to know, what's your impression of the Pope's visit?
Yeah, there are many impressions. I think that this visit really had multiple audiences, and for me, you obviously mentioned my professional credentials, but I'm also an intergenerational residential school survivor. My grandmother and mother were institutionalized at Catholic Indian residential schools, and this apology has really been a long time coming. We were looking for something that was more thorough and more sincere than the April 1st remarks given at Vatican City. And I think that for a lot of people, the gesture of the Pope traveling to Canada, of that ceremony at Musco on Monday, of this mass and all of the various activities, I really think that that will help facilitate the healing process for many survivors. For other people, and perhaps myself included, I feel like the apology comes, a day late and a dollar short. That in order to really advance the pursuit of truth, which, for the record, we still don't know all there is to know about the history of residential schools, about the circumstances in which these children died and then were buried in unmarked graves. So there's a truth bit, but also the reconciliation, and reconciliation really needs action. And so we had very high hopes for this apology, but then also the expectation of accountability and an action plan that would be shared by the Catholic Church.
Okay, so you think that reconciliation could actually be achieved from this visit then? Do you think it's enough just to have that apology, or is there a solution to actually bring healing?
Yeah, I unfortunately do not think that one visit by the Pope, solves our problem of reconciliation. I think that we have a lot of other much deeper work to do, which really would tackle, systemic racism in Canada. It would give, Indigenous nations their sovereignty back. We would have something else in place other than the Oppressive Indian Act. And so there's many things that need addressing. I think potentially what the Pope's visit can do is further this conversation about our knowledge of residential schools, about how the Catholic Church is willing to proceed. And I mean, to be fair, in his apology, he did say that the church is committed to supporting survivors, but also in launching an investigation, which is very curious. I am looking forward to more information about that, especially considering we had our own $60 million investigation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, but then also other actions which I think would bring, you know, a lot of good to Indigenous peoples and push this envelope on reconciliation. So I've mentioned accountability. The Catholic Church needs to share the details of its former employees and clergy who worked at Indian residential schools, considering the last one closed in 1996. That's not that long ago. The church owns land in Canada and continues to profit from that. Is that going to be returned to Indigenous nations? And then also this question of the doctrine of discovery. So a lot really to talk about, and unfortunately, just a very small piece of that was addressed in Musquecheese.
And speaking of that, I'm actually just curious. Do you know why Edmonton and the Musquecheese Reserve was chosen as one of his first and only stops in Canada? Like, why not Kamloops, for example?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I can only speculate. I don't have the answers. But from my thinking as a historian, is that Edmonton is a very significant place for really for thousands of years. It has been a meeting place among First Nations, for trade, for relationships, and so there definitely is that historic piece here in Edmonton. And additionally, Edmonton is widely accessible, especially to northerners and those living in territories that were highly affected by colonialism, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. But in particular, the former site of the Ermineskin Indian Residential School in Musquecheese, this was a pretty typical residential school in the sense that it was large, it housed a lot of children, it operated for a very long time, and it also had, one of the highest rates of disease and illness and death. So that institution was under scrutiny in the 1920s and 1930s for tuberculosis. But when we look at Musquecheese, they've also done a ton of work. The Cree Nations there have come together and have a united education council now. So also really an example of hope and of brilliance around Indigenous education.
Now, your work actually focuses on the residential schools histories and the effects of the residential school system in Canada. So, can you talk maybe about the work of the Governing Circle and the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation?
Yes, I can. And so the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation was created out of the TRC. And what it is really meant to do is to provide a space for archives, for materials related to residential schools, all of the testimony that was given by Indian residential school survivors, which there were about 6 to 7 thousand testimonies that were collected across the country. All of that is stored there, and the NCTR is really meant to be a place where everyday people, you don't have to be academics, you don't have to be researchers. It can be families, it can be survivors, it can be, settler Canadians who are genuinely interested in these histories. They have a very vast collection online, and like you say, I'm a member of the governing circle, but we also have a survivors circle, which really is supposed to help make sure that we keep, our focus very narrow on the history of residential schooling in Canada, and of histories of childhood and Indigenous families.
And Crystal, I'm sure you've heard all kinds of stories, even from your own family, like personal accounts that I'm sure are just really heartbreaking as well.
Yeah, well, absolutely. A lot of my work focuses on Indigenous storytelling, on experiences from survivors, but I actually don't think I'm, you know, in a way, it is quite typical how I came to this work is that I actually knew nothing about it. That I had questions about my own family, I had questions about my community, and I was looking for the answers. And during this time, this would have been the 1980s and the 1990s. Many residential schools were still operating, and it wasn't something that was widely talked about in community. There was still a lot of pain and trauma, and even though a lot of individuals had already started the healing process, that hadn't really happened yet on a collective, in a collective way. And these weren't a part of national conversations. And so when I came to this work, when I started at the University of Alberta, um, that was actually the first time I had heard of residential schools, and so learning about it in university, and then going back to my community and starting these conversations with my grandmother, my mother, and extended family, and that was an extremely hard process. And that was also a very time ago, so 20 years ago, it wasn't widely talked about. And fortunately or unfortunately, whichever way you look at it, especially in the context of the now thousands of unmarked graves, this is something that is a part of Canada's national historical narrative.
Unfortunately, yes. Now, Crystal, last year about this time, we had a couple of interview guests on to talk about their experiences in the residential school system. And one had talked a little bit about medical experiments that took place in Edmonton. So, has your research ever uncovered evidence of children being used for medical experiments like that?
Not my direct research in the sense of formalized experiments. However, we do know a lot of information about the Charles Capsule Indian Hospital in Edmonton. There's also the work of historian Ian Mosby. His work has looked at nutritional experiments on children. But
Wow.
when we look at the way that the bodies of Indigenous children were treated at residential schools, I mean, for sure, there are things like forced monthly pelvic examinations for girls and young women in order to monitor pregnancy, and these would have been at Roman Catholic institutions, right? So all kinds of ways in which students' bodies and health really was not under their own control.
Have you ever found any residential schools where it was actually a good experience for the children?
There are definitely people out there, survivors, who will say, that they did not have a bad experience. Looking back upon it, they got their education. They made, a lifelong network of friends. They were able to travel a little bit with residential schooling. So for sure, there are survivors out there who highlight those experiences, and I think it's important that we listen to, the whole gamut of experiences that happened there. But I think in the bigger context, these are children who were responding to everyday conditions. Their attendance at residential schools was forced under the Indian Act. It was mandatory that they be institutionalized in most cases. And so although, children found ways to make their life happy, maybe they found a sport that they liked, really this whole system was designed to quote unquote kill the Indian in the child. And we now know it was highly oppressive and also genocidal.
Wow. And what effect did these schools have on the families that were left at home?
Yeah, that's very interesting question. This is actually a very understudied topic in the
I'm
sense
sure.
that you don't really read about it in history books, but through my interviews and through just casual conversations with family members and survivors, when that boat or train or aircraft came in late August or early September and took the children away, sometimes for 7 or 8 months, but also sometimes for years,
Mm-hmm.
particularly if you were Inuit and you lived in the Arctic. Those communities were very, very quiet. It was very, full of sorrow, and you had older generations of Indigenous parents and extended family, and also elders just mourning the lack of children in the community. Mhm.
I can imagine. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one legacy too that the schools have left in families was that generational trauma. So, can you maybe talk about how the effects of the harsh treatment and conditions are still being felt today, even generations later? And I mean, you're probably a perfect example of that, right?
Absolutely. The intergenerational trauma is very real. I mean, obviously important to note that we still have, thousands of survivors who are living today, and they were primarily affected by their time at residential schools. But for people like me and also my daughter, who, we don't know our language. And learning that process brings up a lot of emotions. We aren't connected to our land in a certain way that our ancestors were. Some of the traditional forms of storytelling have not been taught in a very long time. And so it's this constant struggle, but also a pleasure, to really try and get back to the very basic lessons and teaching of culture that we should have basically had since birth.
Dr. Fraser, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions.
Absolutely. Professor Crystal Gail Fraser is from the University of Alberta, and she is part of the governing circle guiding the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. Such a pleasure to have her on today. My name's Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.